Welcome to the ECOS meeting here on October 21st, 2020. And today we will be celebrating the 10-year anniversary of CLEAN, the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network. And I have with me today Frank Niepold, Tamara Ledley, and Anna Gold, who are all principals and ringleaders in this particular project. And so I will actually get us started by providing you all with a little bit of a background on the history of, just a very brief history of CLEAN and related climate education, climate engagement projects. So I will now be sharing my screen.
We see your screen.
Okay, now I need to figure out how to
Present.
show the slides.
At the top right, next to share, it says present.
Oh, very good. Okay.
You never had backseat drivers, did you?
It's always been this way, Earl.
So let me take you all back to 1992, and that was the year at the Rio Convention that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed, and soon after, all the countries of the world, for the most part, with a few exceptions, ratified the convention. And a key element of the convention was known as Article 6 of the convention, which talks about education, training, and public awareness. And I would encourage you all in your spare time to take a look at that original Article 6 of the convention. These slides will be made available so you can actually read the slides in more detail, because we have packed a lot of history in here. But the key elements of the Article 6 of the convention were to have all the countries that were agreeing to this convention to develop education and public awareness programs on climate change, and also to promote public participation in addressing climate change and its effects in order to develop adequate responses. And finally, there was a call for collaboration and cooperation at every level, including the international level, to make that happen. Now, fast forward to 2004, I was working at, through the University of Colorado at Boulder for the NOAA Paleoclimatology program. Some of you may remember a movie that came out in 2004 called The Day After Tomorrow, which was actually about abrupt climate change. And it starred Dennis Quaid as a NOAA paleoclimatologist. And he was not playing me, he was playing a make-believe character. But we were doing some heroic work behind the scenes to try to translate climate-related science into educational and public information settings. We developed this paleo perspective on abrupt climate change that came out in 2004. And actually, the White House at the time tried to stop it from being published because we were timing the release of this website to the release of the movie. And the New York Times threatened to have a big front page article about the fact that the White House was preventing us from publishing this website. And so the end of the story is that the website did come out and the movie came out, and there was a lot of misinformation about climate change in that movie. But it did raise awareness about climate change. But I realized that as I got involved with a project called DLISI, the Digital Library for Earth System Education, that there was just not very much good information about climate change, even on a resource like this Digital Library for Earth System Education. So I asked the National Science Foundation if I could get a little bit of money to develop a idea that we called the Climate Change Collection, where we would bring in experts, teachers and scientists to review resources and rate them, annotate them. And so we developed a suite of 40 digital resources through this National Science Foundation grant. And that came out in 2005. And actually it was at a meeting, a DLISI meeting in St. Petersburg, Florida, where I met Frank Niepold, who was about to start a job at NOAA. And we were both influenced and impressed by the work of the ocean literacy community, which NOAA had been very involved with. And the ocean literacy folks had put together an ocean literacy framework, and we thought, well, we need something like that for climate-related topics, and Frank will talk more about this in a minute. But the idea is to come up with like the top 7 concepts that people should know about when it comes to understanding oceans, or what we wanted to do is climate and later focus on energy issues. So the climate literacy principles did get released. It took a couple of years to put them together, but they came out officially in 2009. And Frank was the one who did most of the work behind the scenes. But that framework was really important as we moved forward with this idea of a climate literacy collection of resources. And there was an opportunity through the National Science Foundation to develop a National Science Digital Library. And we proposed such a digital library focused on climate and energy. And we called it CLEAN, the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network. And it was supported by the Climate Literacy Network, and Tamara will explain a little bit of the differences between those and how ultimately they did get merged together. But very briefly, CLEAN is both a community, an online community, and an online collection of resources. Anna will give you an overview of what actually is in that catalog and what some of those resources are. But I moved on from the University of Colorado, and in 2012, we helped host a climate literacy summit in Berkeley, California, where we put together a series of recommendations, a national climate and energy literacy campaign using the collective impact model. And we had a lot of different partners involved. The White House was sent a copy of the report that we issued from that summit, and there was some good work that came out of that my colleagues will tell you about in a minute here. But I ended up moving to Europe from California in 2015 and got involved with the United Nations climate change efforts, and realized that Article 6 of the convention was struggling. They were actually in the process of renaming Article 6 of the convention as ACE, which stands for Action for Climate Empowerment. And I was at the meeting in Bonn, Germany in 2015 where they did that. And I proposed to the Secretariat that we started organization, a constituency similar to some of the existing groups that would support the efforts of the Secretariat. But I suggested we needed one for education, communication, and outreach stakeholders. So ECOS was born from that. We were recognized by the Secretariat in 2016, and many of you are very familiar with ECOS, and so I won't go into more detail about that, other than to say that CLEAN was certainly inspired by ECOS in many ways. There are substantial differences, and at this point, ECOS is funded by volunteers. ECOS has no funding, and so we're volunteer driven, as was the Climate Literacy Network early on. But in any event, let me turn it over to Frank, and he can tell you another part of the story.
Right, now I got to unmute. So thank you, Mark. This is a really fun opportunity for us. And you know, this idea of 10 years is a strange one, right? Because in one way we're older than that, and another way we're not yet 10. So it's, you know, let's leave this as a fuzzy thing. Just so Mark, I'm just going to raise my hand and then I'll go to the next slide. So one important thing in the saga that we haven't talked about yet is a paper that was released by a group of authors that I was part of called The Case for Climate Literacy in the 21st Century. Turns out that was a pretty seminal paper that a lot of people who are active in this space go back to as one of the real key parts where we talk about basically ACE and how to do it from our experiences and perspectives. But you know, that was a seminal piece, and then we eventually, you know, picked up on that work that was done in the ocean literacy structure. Actually, Mark, it was a little bit more specific. When I came into NOAA, they basically said, you will be leading the charge to make climate literacy. with no money, no resources, no partnerships, no frameworks, no, other than the ocean literacy, and go. We got a small grant back in 2007 to start this process. Tamara, I think you were at the AAAS meeting with Ted Willard in the basement of the Department of Commerce.
Yeah.
Yep, that was actually the building blocks to the climate literacy guide, and then we released the first version in 2008, and then very quickly released an updated version in 2009 under the Obama administration, because we could be more ambitious and more aligned. So, and then another key piece of the story is the energy literacy guide that came out, and it's been subsequently updated in 2012 to 17. So, if you keep on going through the slides, next one, Mark. Doesn't want it. Yeah, there we go. There we go. So I'm not going to talk through all of this. A lot has gone on in the clean community. And one of the most important things that really convinced me that networks were such a powerful part of the story was that people come together on this topic and collaborate naturally, because it's so daunting that people can't do it themselves. And so and it's been my experience is that the people working in climate education, community engagement, outreach, you name it, are hyper collaborative. And so this kind of timeline that I leave you, and as I was thinking about this, one of the things that was most pivotal in all of this was COP21. We built up to COP21, and then, so you can see all these. Again, I'm not going to get you through this, but if you go to the next slide, during that time, one of the most important things that happened was funding. Congress had dedicated 3 federal agencies, NOAA, NASA, and National Science Foundation, to fund climate change education. It grew the community immensely, because now we had a lot of other practitioners who could come into the space, but CLEAN helped facilitate the community and the collaborations between these grants. So, that backbone supporting capability, building collaboration from those who were funded was really, really important. You can look at all the funding activities in that link there. Again, these slides will be available for you, but without the funding increase, it's really hard to have a robust community. And, but just having the funding isn't enough. You have to actually have the network structures that CLEAN provided. So let's go to the next one. And so from COP21, a burst of activity came through the community, a new phase of activities, and Tamara's going to get into some of this, and Anna's going to get into some of this. But for the ECOS community, the most important one is the last one, the green one, which is where we are launching an ACE national strategy development process for the United States. We're in the midst of it. You'll have an opportunity to engage if you so choose, if you don't already know about what we're talking about. But that totally came from the partnership between ECOS and CLEAN, and a lot of this heavy work that we've been doing. So go to the next one, Mark. Again, you'll be able to read these in detail. This morning I went through and Tamara updated it. I gave you some of the big highlights of accomplishment. And when I wrote down all of this morning, the CLEAN network has been super busy for our 12 years, 10 years, whatever you want to call it, years, but the last decade plus of real significant community-driven work. So you can see there that a lot of the key dates and timelines are all sequential, but really where we are right now is at ACE National Strategy. That's the most important piece of where we are, and that would not have happened without our collaboration with the ECOS network. Next slide. I think this, bottom line, we have reaffirmed the 1992 article in the United States and come to the sound realization that education, community engagement, outreach, communication are critical to climate action. Not just nice to have on the side, but critical. And so we're documenting that in the strategy. So the next slide. And this is how you can get involved. If you want to go to that bit.ly link, I'll put it in after my remarks are done. I'm almost done. Is you can actually engage in this process if you want to. If you want to learn how we're doing it, but also, so we have the opening up the community review tomorrow at 1 o'clock Eastern time in the United States. So it's been a busy time, but we're ready for the next decade. Let's go from there.
Okay, thank you, Frank and Mark. So go ahead to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how the Clean Network got started and why it got started, basically. So you've already heard from Frank that the climate literacy essential principles the initial version was published in 2008. The US government supported that work. They could support the development of these climate literacy essential principles, but they could not advocate for their implementation. And while that first version hadn't quite yet been published, a number of us who had been involved, on the order of 20 of us who had been involved in developing that document, realized that we had to form another group in order to move the actual implementation forward. So 20 of us, we were at a conference in Washington, D.C. The National Council for Science and the Environment runs an annual conference. In January of 2008, their 8th national conference was on climate change and science and solutions, which is why a lot of us were there. And we came together at the Quiznos that Frank mentioned earlier, 20 of us, to form the Climate Literacy Network, as we call it then. And there at the bottom is our initial banner. We established right away weekly teleconferences and a very active listserv. We began organizing sessions at professional meetings. So go ahead to the next slide. And then, as Mark mentioned, out of the weekly conversations of this week, the conversations about a collection, Mark had started an initial pilot collection, but then this opportunity that Mark mentioned, the National Science Digital Library, had an opportunity to propose a collection on climate change. So the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, the CLEAN Collection, was funded in January of 2010, and we went live with 100 activities in November of 2010. In that process, we developed a very rigorous set of review criteria that if you go to the website, you can actually look them up, but basically the resources were reviewed for scientific accuracy, pedagogical effectiveness, and technical quality. And 3 to 7 different people with the expertise in the science and the pedagogy and the technical aspects reviewed those resources. The entire collection was syndicated to NOAA in 2012, and that provided two different avenues in which people could benefit from accessing the collection. And I think that the syndication has gone farther than that now. So going to the next slide. So we had this CLEAN collection and we had the Climate Literacy Network. And while those of us that were intricately involved with both knew that this was basically a partnership, that they were both together, a lot of people got things confused. So we ultimately renamed the Climate Literacy Network to the CLEAN Network, the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network community. And so the logos at the bottom were all the organizations that were involved in that, actually the initial proposal for the collection itself: Turk, Ceres, CERC, NOAA, and NSF. And actually the Department of Energy was also involved. Going to the next slide. This merger, so we merged the two in 2013. And so this graphic was just to really highlight that the overarching nature of CLEAN as a portal that contain both the community and the resources, as well as a professional development for teachers to be able to really address this effectively with their students. So going to the next slide. So I wanted to just talk a little bit. Frank listed a whole lot of different avenues that the CLEAN has been very, very effective in all of our accomplishments over the past 10 years. But I wanted to give you a sense of how the ability to be nimble and collaborative had advantages, and both at the national scale and at the individual scale. So I'm just going to talk about 2 examples here. The first example is the White House Office of Science, Technology, and Policy, OSTP, released a call to action on climate change education. This release happened on October 22nd in 2014. The Clean Network, because of its ongoing teleconferences every Tuesday at 1 o'clock Eastern time, we were able to repurpose our teleconference on October 28th to focus on this call of to action. And we invited Laura Pettis, who is the person at OSTP who had released this call to action, to come onto our telecon and clarify what was being requested. And what that resulted in is that by the deadline to submit these this input, by November 7th, 42 of the 150 submissions were received from the Clean Network. And then ultimately the White House OSTP published a fact sheet called Lifting America's Game in Climate Education, Literacy, and Training on December 3rd, and 9 of the 25 items there were from the Clean Network. Okay, so go to the next slide. So this was something that really happened on the national scale. Can you go to the next slide?
It's not moving. Let me see what the problem is. There we go. No?
Okay, that's yeah, no, go ahead, back one. No, it actually, go back. Yeah, so I had edited this a little bit, and that's why. So the second part there is how the power of the network at the individual scale. So we had a middle school teacher from Germany requested ideas from the Clean Network through the listserv on how to engage her students with learning disabilities and understanding climate change. She received input from educators across the United States over a 2-week period, and she was just thrilled with the response. So this was really this just shows the power of the network at the individual scale. So go on to the next slide. Okay, so the collective impact has already been mentioned. Mark mentioned the collective impact model, and I began to see parallels here. I was introduced to the collective impact model at that Climate and Energy Summit that Mark mentioned in California in 2012. And just to lay out what the aspects of this framework are, is that in order to increase your collective impact, you need 5 aspects: a common agenda, shared measurement system, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, and a backbone support organization. The Clean Network is very professionally diverse. We actually conducted a survey in 2013 to look at the diversity of the Clean Network. And we found that over 21 professions were represented there and over 60 professional societies. It has a shared broad goal. It's not well articulated in terms of what a usual collective impact action would be, but clearly there is a shared goal, many mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communication, both with the listserv and our weekly teleconference, and basically is a rudimentary backbone support organization. From the time of that conference in 2012 that Mark led, that was the first of 6 conferences between December of 2012 and February of 2014, where at different meetings, we basically collected information from the community about their views of how the Clean Network should move forward and how it fit into this, and we worked on how it fit into this collective impact model. And so I've included here both the reference to what the collective impact model is, but also the paper that we published in 2014, moving towards collective impact on climate change literacy, the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network. And you'll notice that the 4 people who are co-authors on this paper are the 4 presenters today. So you can see that the results of that conversation here. So going to, I think that's probably, I think that's probably the last slide. So I will, can you go to the next? I think that's the last. Yes. So I'll turn it over to Anna Gold to talk about moving Clean forward from there.
Thank you, Mark, Frank, and Tamara. It's so fun to go walk on this memory lane. I started with Clean about 10 years ago. And so I've been kind of living this memory, and hearing you all talk about it is really fun. So I'm excited to talk about where Clean is now. You've already heard from Tamara how it all started with an initial collection of 100 resources, and then we really moved into providing more and more support. And kind of jumping forward, Clean, you see here a screenshot of the Clean portal at cleanout.org. We still have at the center in a collection, and we have professional development activities, and we have the network. And next slide, Mark, please. Thank you. You can see now that a decade later, we have over 700 resources, and we've actually, I went into the review tool, and we had 3,000 resources reviewed for inclusion into the collection that were actually tracked and logged in the collection. So we do a lot of maintenance and keep the collection live. So these 700 resources are really called in as the current active collection. We have over 700,000 annual sessions. So we really have in this decade, with all these efforts, brought Clean to the forefront of the portal, the go-to portal for climate education resources. And we have, we've vetted over 30,000 resources, and just to consider them for inclusion. So the collection is going strong. There's a lot of support provided here, a lot of use. We also provide professional development, and it's interesting, every month we run web analytics on our collection, and we always see that our teaching about pages, which are essentially a one long page summary of how do you what's at the core of each of these principles, and how do you teach us, what are misconceptions. These are always at the top of our web analytics, so they get heavy use. And then we continue running webinars and to support learning from educators that want to learn more about how to teach climate. And then clearly you've heard a lot about the network. A little snapshot, I pulled the numbers yesterday. We have 770 members currently. It's a very vibrant network. If you're part of it, you know that. There's about 50 messages per month on average. And there's weekly presentations, discussions, panel discussions, and the network has really become and morphed into being a place for this vision work that Frank talked about for ACE, where we had a series of panel discussions organized and bringing in leaders from the entire community. Next slide, please. So in terms of where Clean is now, and I want to just highlight a few of the efforts that are ongoing, what's new. And you can see there Mark's cursor. He's kind of going through my little screenshots that I took. I just want to essentially say Clean, what we are trying to do is we are trying to respond to needs and new development in the education world. You can see here at the center lower part, you can see our entry point into the NGSS. So once, you heard we were supported a lot of the NGSS work, but then we also really took the NGSS into the collection and tagged everything so that to support teaching climate in the framework of NGSS. So you can, Clean is aligned with the NGSS, or all resources are, as much as the developers align them with NGSS. So that's one effort that we aligned and have been doing ongoing, have been supporting. Another example is just above that screenshot, you see the National Climate Assessment. When that came out, we developed these resources of how do you teach, how do you use the National Climate Assessment as a teaching tool, and that has been updated also for the newest National Climate Assessment. I just saw the first email last week from Frank that there is the next iteration is in the works, so we'll keep doing this, but we really want to have put the fingertips of teachers resources that are relevant for their teaching. Similarly, if you move over to the right, we have we developed a page. Obviously, teaching controversy in the classroom is hard, so how do we do that well? And we've developed resources around that, including a webinar. with the pandemic, we developed resources for teachers and for parents. How do you teach from home about climate, and pulled resources together and highlighted how that could be done. And just yesterday, we had a launch presentation from a group that developed a partner document to the climate literacy document that they call culturally relevant climate literacy resources. So you can see that, you can explore that on our pages, where they took the big ideas from the climate literacy and put it in a framework of indigenous cultural and indigenous thinking. A terrific set of resources, and we're highlighting these in CLEAN. And then finally, also hot off the press are our elementary resources. CLEAN has now, with funding from NASA, developed an initial collection of elementary teaching resources. For the last 9 years, we were focused on middle school through high school, and now we broadened into elementary and have, I think, released a set of 65 or 70 resources to teaching elementary, including webinars and teaching support pages and things like that. Lastly, I just wanted to mention, because I just talked about funding, NASA funded this elementary resource collection, but NOAA has been our ongoing sustained funder, and the initial funder to launch the collection that Mark talked about was NSF. So we've had tri-agency funding here within the US. Lots of other things going on, including translation of the principal pages into Spanish and things like that. But I just want to leave it at that and say we're trying to be responsive and to community needs. And I think that's maybe a good starting place to take this memory lane to think, what's the next decade going to look like? And I think Frank has already highlighted the ACE work he's involved in. And so we wanted to open it up for question, discussion. How can CLEAN and ECOS, you know, this collaboration be strengthened in the next decade? What do we need?
And just so we're clear, the ACE framework that we're looking at is focused at the next decade, but it's not, you know, that's just one piece of that puzzle. So that's kind of what we thought, you know, looking 10 years back and then looking 10 years forward might be an interesting way to have this conversation.
So any questions or comments? We can obviously keep talking about this for probably days.
Literally.
But, if any of you folks have any questions about what we presented, or yeah, I think Deborah, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so hi. So thank you so much. You know, what you have done is so magnificent on so many different levels. I also want to thank you because you have housed the Sustainability Improved Student Learning Collection at the CERC site. And I just want you to know that that is going into a global guidance document, Tamara, on greening the workforce. That's going to go out to all the countries of the world. So you and I haven't talked in a long time, but that Sizzle site is still being very actively used as part of what you guys do at circ.carleton.edu. And I guess my question that I have for you is, if I wanted to focus on any of the resources that get at how do we prepare the green workforce, what would be the best way for me to find those resources so that we can include not just the Sizzle stuff, but the other resources in this global guidance document? It's coming out of UNEP, and we definitely want to make sure we include what you've got that's relevant.
Let me take a first whack at this, Deborah. One of the challenges we have, just like if you go back to 2005, the work that Mark was doing with the collection, which was more about lessons and units and resources and demonstrations, that same reality which is fractured. A lot of people are making things that are completely disconnected from each other, and a user goes in and sees noise. Google or search engines are not your friend. You're wasting teachers' times and educators' time, which is their most precious resource. So it's like bad, bad, bad. But the good news is there's lots of rich pieces out there, but the problem is the hay is covering those needles. The same is true with workforce. And what unfortunately we have to date, in the United States at least, is we have a lot of organic, self-initiated, West Texas high schools are teaching wind energy in high school, career and technical, completely independent of anything anybody else is doing. We have Wyoming community colleges teaching operations and maintenance, technical certifications, and you have offshore wind out of New Bedford, Mass, and it's completely fractured. And so the same kind of process we used in clean is yet to be done. So there isn't a collection. There's just a wild, wild west out there, in my experience.
Right, which is why I'm asking, given the wild, wild west, yeah, Tamara, go ahead. How can you help me find the juicy piece?
All right, so basically, the last few years, what I've been focused on is really bringing understanding of climate change to people who are not climate scientists, not technical people, never going to be. I actually teach global climate change at a school, a university that is a business school. Every single one of my students is a business student. And so what I really work to do is they have to take a science course for their bachelor's degree. So what I work to do is understanding the climate science relevant to their business careers. So I look for examples of where understanding climate change has impacted various kinds of businesses. Wine industry, agricultural industry, making beer. I mean, the impact of climate change on the barley crop has huge impacts on the availability and the price of beer. Also bring in examples of also sea level rise impacts communities. Well, there was a study done on how clear sky flooding, high tide flooding in Annapolis, Maryland in the United States impacts parking lot revenues, and by implication, then those small businesses. So a lot of my students are going to be in small businesses. And so seeing that they have to develop that climate resilience. So having an understanding of it, not expecting them to be experts, but expecting them to understand enough so that they can understand the data and know when they need to get that technical expertise. And I think that, so I tend to use resources from the Clean Collection and from other places, and then I try to bring those aspects in. And I think that that's really an effective way to really address the workforce issue.
Yeah, that matches our global guidance document kind of set up the structure. But we do use what are the key components of quality assignments out of the Sizzle collection that you guys house for us. Please don't ever take it down without talking to us first, because it's going so international. And it says, you've got to focus on not doom and gloom, but on solutions, and engage students in systemic thinking, moving from thinking to analysis to action.
And I'm trying to do that actually even with the programs in teacher professional development, and really addressing that local aspect and having the teachers try to use resources from the Clean Collection to address the local issues that are impacting that place, so that it makes it relevant to the student to learn that science and to learn the skills. So that's another avenue in terms of the K-12 area.
Yep, got it. Thank you.
Also, Deborah, the ACE National Strategy Framework, which will come out tomorrow for community review, has a whole section on this, on what we need to do. Oh yeah, we had a whole dialogue about it. There's a whole section on this. So please, if the recommendations don't do what you think are needed for the next 10 years, push it.
Okay, and that's going to come, I'm going to get that in an email?
Tomorrow.
Okay, great, Frank, thanks. Okay, that was my question.
Okay, cool. So Earl, I see that you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you. So I'm asking this question from the perspective of someone who finds myself frequently challenged in the space of environmental justice or interfaith work in just getting people to communicate with one another. And I was quite impressed when I did my Google search, Frank. NASA was the first thing that popped up. So congratulations on that. But on a broader scale, the resources you guys have brought to my attention today are absolutely wonderful, but to the best of my knowledge, completely unknown to so many people who are doing climate and environmental justice work.
Yep.
And I'm sort of just raising this question because it's the same sort of challenge. What's happening in Massachusetts stays in Massachusetts, you know, and
Yep.
and even though there is a lot of dialogue that goes on between, let's say, Harvard and the other schools there and the schools out here, there still is difficulty in like, oh, we have a great idea. Well, we've already done that over here, but you don't know about it yet. So that's the general question about communications plans to get beyond maybe those who are specifically identified as being in the education field.
You know, let me just say real quick, absolutely is the case. If we didn't have the rich work across our landscapes in the United States, and I don't believe this is unique to the United States, it would be hard to build the network. There would be nothing to network. But that's where we are. We have a lot of richness, but we have a lot of places where that richness could be beneficial. And so those bridging structures, we had a whole piece of the ACE National Strategy, a whole dialogue about this exact piece, that we need to do a much better job of taking these organic, emergent, excellent work and spreading it and replicating it and transferring it where it makes sense. That is I think a big part of the next decade. Absolutely.
And,
But
and when we talk later, I'll give you a little more background on
appreciate that.
a wonderful conference that was held on ecologically informed theological education.
Awesome.
And so we had a variety of different speakers as well as different faiths represented. And it's a question of how do all this wonderful work you guys have been doing, how do I get the people who are trying to do this other project aware of what it is that's already been done?
But also Earl, back and forth, right?
Yeah.
It goes the other way as well. You know, I'm looking at Jason Serbanek from Ohio here. Hey, Jason. But I mean, you know, Jason's a perfect example of this, where Jason, you created a whole thing on warrant and argumentation in education that is like no one else has ever done this before. That should not be isolated in Ohio. You know, this is how this works, right? We find great stuff, and then other people find that it's great, and then build and replicate and emulate.
I think the other thing that's valuable is if you have a community that maybe doesn't know about it, the best person to share it is an emissary from that community who finds value in it.
Yep.
So we've shared it with a lot of people in the faith community that maybe it's been shared more locally in Ohio, but it means something different. It's coming from somebody within the community who knows the sharing structure and the publishing structure. A colleague and I with the extension have a program we're doing tomorrow for 2 weeks for some specific faith groups in Indiana and Ohio. And we were invited in, but somebody there sharing that was the way that scaled. So if you find value in it and you know how to share in that community, you might be the best person to do it because people will trust you.
Okay. Can I ask you if I put my email in the chat to send me links to the two things you just mentioned, Jason?
Sure. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. I didn't even know that was going on.
Yeah, we have regular engagement with our extension community and a number of faith communities. So we've had some success there with two colleagues and myself. And by the way, thank you for all the work you four have done on this. I kind of came in after everything already been rolling along. I know I only pop into meetings periodically, but it is valuable to stay connected, and it is the only touch point I think a lot of those of us spread across the country have, even if it's infrequent. But it's had helped move the needle forward, and it's actually helped build morale too. When you have rough days, you feel like there's other people that are in the trenches doing the work. So thank you.
That's a great point, Jason. That is so true.
So anybody else would like to chime in here? If not, I actually have a question for my colleagues, which is that I think, as some of you know, one of the reasons I moved to Europe, aside from the fact that I'm married to a European, is that I was a bit frustrated with the polarized climate politics in the US. And I really enjoyed working internationally with the folks with the International Polar Year, which several of us were also involved with more than a decade ago. And a question that I have, obviously the past 4 years have been really tough for climate politics in the US. That may change. We'll see what shakes out. Certainly the work that you're doing with the ACE national strategy is really amazing that this is now on the table right now, and it's actually happening. But what are your thoughts on where do we go from here internationally? How can the work that's going on in the US and the work that's gone into clean, how can that help inform the international efforts around the world? We've also tried with ECOS to use that collective impact model of providing the backbone and having constant communication, shared metrics, and so forth. But of course, we've not been funded, and so that's been an impediment in our ability to serve as that sort of strategic backbone. But what are your thoughts, Frank, Anna, Tamara, in terms of where can we go to help the rest of the planet from the lessons that we've all been learning the past 10 years or so?
I guess I could go first. I think that it's been touched on a few times here, and it's been the focus of, and I've already mentioned this, is that while you still need to rigorously address the educational community, teachers, college, university, faculty, but also how do you address those people that don't have, that have different kinds of careers, totally what would traditionally not be related to climate change at all, and help them to see how understanding climate change, it will impact their decisions in their careers, whatever they happen to be, and to help make that connection. And actually just on a co-author on a paper about on addressing climate change in higher education. But the reason I was invited, it was a really interesting paper because they were developing this paper. All the rest of the authors are from the UK, and they are all not scientists. And so the focus of the paper was, how do you integrate understanding about climate change into activities in an economics class, in an English class, in a humanities class of some kind, in a literature class, in almost any other kinds of class. And what they did not have was somebody that could talk about how it was actually being addressed in science classes. And that's where they asked me to join and be part of this paper. And it was really interesting to look at that aspect. And so actually this was a truly international paper. I'm the only author from the United States. There's 3 other authors, all from the UK. And I think the other attraction was that the lead author was from a business school in Nottingham, at Nottingham University. And I was teaching a science class at a business university. So making those kind of connections, reaching out to communities that would not usually think about climate change. I think that's another way of extending your impact. And Mark, I think a lot of your work with the Powers of 10, you didn't mention that today, but a lot of the work that you've done has tried to address those kinds of communities beyond just the educational community. So that's my thoughts on that.
Anna, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Tamara. And yeah, I've been recently involved through NOAA funding in resiliency work and really supporting student action and student engagement. And I feel there's so much gloom and doom in climate, and it's not just gloom and doom. I mean, it's dire, the situation is, and it feels so challenging mentally to really, for students to learn about what is happening without giving them tools. So I feel like one of the things we as educators really need to do is provide tools and ways. And I mean, Deborah, you talked about the Green Deal and, you know, green jobs. And I think really focusing on what can individuals do besides turning off their lights and really getting engaged in action, I think is a very powerful way to keep engagement going, because we all know what happens psychologically if people feel overwhelmed and afraid. They just pull back and don't want to hear about it. That's one of the grounds for maybe just not believing in climate change, because it's too hard to do that. So I think that would be fantastic if across all the different educational channels, nationally and internationally, we can really inspire student action.
So I mean, one of the things I've clearly learned across this saga that we've been through, and it looks like we've got more sagas to come, is the power of networks. We need to invest in the infrastructure. I mean, one of the things that's coming through very loud and clear is, even though Clean did what it didn't have a lot of support. We've marshaled as much support as we could, but it's not anywhere near adequate to what is needed. But that doesn't stop. Those network structures don't stop at national boundaries. I mean, Article 6 clearly calls out for international collaboration. And that collaboration should not be just parties, not nations, you know, government to government. It should be, you know, the people here. I mean, I'm U.S. federal government. But, you know, the power of working with the community is incredibly powerful. And I think that in many ways, ECOS, while it's still emerging as a structure, has tremendous potential, because that's what we've learned in Clean, and that's what we've learned in the United States. And Clean is not just the United States, just dominantly the United States. But I think if I was going to call out one thing that is where the emerging examples and bright spots between building collaborations between people working on, you know, resilience work in the United States and people working on resilience work in Africa, the people working on career work in South America and people working on, you know, work in you know, Massachusetts. You know, wind is wind, solar is solar. Living shorelines are living shorelines. You know, they're not unique to any one country's concept, and the work to support the doing of it isn't unique to any one country's context. There's some translational issues, don't get me wrong, but I think, you know, if I've learned anything in the last decade is really expanding the infrastructures to hold and enable that sharing and that practice building is one of the fastest ways that I see practice transforming across the world. How it's non-trivial, but, you know, the U.S. also has international investments. We have, you know, USAID, we have the State Department and all the embassies, we have other international investments, not just, you know, whether it's Fish and Wildlife or Forest Service or national parks or NOAA. You know, the international dimension is something that we need to figure out how to build and bridge. But if we learned anything in the last set of conversations, build the infrastructure that enables that. It doesn't happen by itself. And we have to prioritize it. And that's something that's definitely coming through in the loud and clear in the ACE national strategy work, is that infrastructure, telephones don't stop at national boundaries. There's not like one universal, you know, my cell phone connects to your cell phone, Mark, because of international architectures. We need that too for this work.